Yeah, my name is Ken, and on behalf of Minnesota Hands Off Honduras, I want to welcome you to our conversation tonight with Karen Spring. Before we get started, I want to say a few words about Hands Off Honduras and also about Karen. Hands Off Honduras got started in 2009 following the illegal military coup that led to the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Honduras, Mel Zelaya. Okay, good. Thank you for my assistant here. Well, since 2009, Hands Off Honduras has stood in solidarity with Hondurans who have been working to establish a truly democratic government in place of the illegal, corrupt, and fraudulently elected governments that have remained in power since 2009 through repression, human rights violations, and military aid from the United States. Karen Spring, who we're going to meet tonight, and we're really excited about that, is a true warrior since 2009, working to establish democracy, economic justice, and liberation from U.S. and Canadian imperialism since 2009. Karen is not only an impressive human rights defender, she is also a published author who has written articles on human rights abuses in the mining industry in Honduras, and also an article talking about the horrible conditions under which Honduran women work in Canadian-owned maquiladoras garment industries in Honduras. She is also an expert on asylum cases, and I'm a volunteer attorney for the Minnesota Advocates, and so I was really excited today to take her to the Minnesota Advocates, where she gave a talk on human rights conditions in Honduras. And the exciting thing is that when she came here, she came from Kansas City, where she had just written a 15-page brief for the attorneys down there that were representing a Honduran in an asylum hearing, and the attorney for immigration folded and didn't even go to the hearing because, as I said, Karen is an incredible researcher. We feel that tonight we're all going to benefit from listening to Karen talk about current conditions on the ground in Honduras. She's also going to talk about the roots of migration from Honduras. And finally, she's going to talk about all the ways that all of us can take steps to oppose the corruption, the militarization, and all the human rights abuses that are created or that are carried out by the regime of Juan Orlando Hernandez, and also give us some insight into the way in which the United States foreign policy has played a role in creating those problems. Before I turn it over to Karen, I do want to thank that we do have co-sponsors of the group MIRAC, the Anti-War Committee, Witness for Peace Midwest, COPAL, the Mayflower Congregational Church, UCC, St. Joan of Arc Catholic community, particularly the Welcome the Stranger group, or ministry there. We also got a lot of help from Gary King from Amnesty International, from Michelle Rivero from the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in Hennepin County, that in terms of publicizing the event. We also supporting the event was Women Against Military Madness as a co-sponsor. And let me see if I've left anybody out here. Is there anybody I've left out, Carla? I think that there's another peace group. But anyways, okay, I'm sorry. Sherilyn?
We have just a correction.
Okay, a correction, okay.
The Office of Immigrant Refugee Affairs in the City of Minneapolis.
In the city of Minneapolis, I'm sorry, okay, well, thank you for my help from my assistant there. So anyway, we've got a great turnout here, and it's a tribute to all the help that we got from the different groups to make this happen. And we're really excited about Karen Spring being here, because there's nobody that I know of that knows more about Honduras and human rights and all the issues down there. I just have one other announcement here from Carla, who's doing our live streaming here. I want to just read this. This event is being live streamed to the Minnesota Hands Off Honduras Facebook page, where it will be archived for later viewing, and will also be available on YouTube in a couple of days. There may be video of the audience during the question and answer, so if you don't want to be filmed, please let Carla know. And then one other event, I think Karen's going to address this. At some point we want to pass the hat, and Karen will explain how the money can be used to pay for the bail of 3 political prisoners in the maximum security prison in Honduras. And so I'll let her talk about that. So thank you very much for coming. And I hope you signed in, because Hands Off Honduras is trying to build this membership, and hopefully some of you might come to some of our future meetings. So Karen?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for coming out in the storm. If it was Honduras, very few people would show up because of the rain. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of the co-sponsors tonight, and to Hands Off Honduras for the amazing welcome to your city, the Twin Cities. It's my first time here. And to Ken, who's been with me all day and who's been played a huge role in organizing all of the events. It's been really amazing. So thank you very much, Ken. So every time I come to the U.S. or I go to Canada, I live in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. I've been in Honduras and lived in Honduras for 10 years. I arrived to Honduras shortly after the 2009 military coup. In July of 2009, and I've stayed ever since, coming back and forth, obviously. I'm Canadian, so you'll catch my accent at some point. I always get busted on that when I come to the U.S. But I wanted to say, every time that I come to, whether it's in Canada or whether it's the U.S., I sort of have to take off my Honduras cap, and I have to put on the U.S. cap to talk to a U.S. audience, and the same goes with Canada, because in all these different places, the way people view and understand these issues is different. You wouldn't talk necessarily to Canadian audience the same way you talk to a U.S. audience. But tonight, what I wanted to really focus on what many of you are hearing, and talk about, and use that as a way to talk about what's going on in Honduras and the crisis that Honduras remains in. And one of the things that I think most of you have probably established is that we hear all the time about people that are at the border, Hondurans that are at the border, the camps at the border, the atrocious conditions, the atrocious treatment of migrants from Central America at the border. And that's sort of been a big hot topic in the news, and it's something that's really important. But the thing is that we never hear, especially in the corporate media, why Hondurans are coming to the border. And it's never talked about in the corporate media, the root causes that are driving Hondurans to the border. Why are they coming in? Well, first, why are so many people leaving Honduras? And then why did they start coming in caravans? Most of the caravans were started in the northern city of San Pedro Sula in Honduras, and then they crossed over into Guatemala and up into Mexico. And I think talking about the root factors, you can't really begin to talk about the root factors without addressing the fact that Honduras is run by a dictatorship that is backed by the United States government. And people are fleeing that dictatorship. And I think at least since the 2017 elections in Honduras, which were seen as widely fraudulent, the government has been in power, remained in power because of U.S. support. It really doesn't have any legitimacy in Honduras, and that is very evident when you look at the number of protests that go on every single day in the country, and people have united under the saying "Fuera Ho," which means "Get out Juan Orlando Hernandez," that's the name of the president. They use the initials JOH to talk about him. And so it's really unfortunate that people don't see the Hondurans that are fleeing to the border, as that really Hondurans are voting with their feet, and they're voting on U.S. policy in their own country. So I think today's crisis in Honduras, and I was flipping through the news today as we were going to different meetings, is that today there was a whole bunch of road blockades, as there have been for several months in Honduras. Today, the high school students in the largest high school in Tegucigalpa, the Central Institute is what it's called, occupied their high school, and they blocked all the roads around their high school, demanding that the government basically step down or get out of power. The two major boulevards were also blocked, where Hondurans set up tires across the road, and they burn the tires, and they try and block off the traffic for several hours before the state security forces come in and evict them. And it's usually a very violent eviction. It's very common now that tear gas and smelling tear gas in the major cities is become a daily part of living in Honduras. One of the first things I did when I came to the U.S. was buy gas masks that some human rights observers and defenders have asked me to purchase for them. And so I think that talking about the current crisis, is that my mic?
Weather.
Oh.
Weather alert.
So basically, the protests that are going on in Honduras, like I mentioned, that continue today, are. Okay.
Turn your sound down.
So the protest that we're seeing today in Honduras is basically Hondurans are taking to the street once again, and this time, and there's been several crises in the last 10 years since the 2009 coup, but like I mentioned, since 2017, the elections, which I'll get to a little bit later, Hondurans have gone to the street. And this time, it's a fight against the privatization of healthcare and education. And so who is on the street and why? So mostly the platform for the defense of healthcare and education is being led by doctors and healthcare workers and teachers. And it's very unusual, I think, in any country to see physicians taking to the street. They're usually not a profession that are the ones leading big protests. And so it's quite amazing that the conditions have gotten so bad in the country that physicians are taking to the street to protest. And so these protests have been going on, like I mentioned, since April of this year. And like I mentioned, Hondurans are blocking roads, and they focus a lot on roads that basically block and hurt the economy, because they know that's where the government is sort of forced to respond, and that bothers them the most. And I've been in a lot of these protests, and it's interesting because you often always see this special police unit that is the Tigres, which is a special police unit that is vetted, funded, and trained by the United States government. And so your tax dollars are assisting in repressing almost daily Honduran people that are protesting and trying to defend public education and healthcare. In one community in a neighborhood in Tegucigalpa, about 2 weeks ago, I was in a protest of high school students, and you should really see the high school students in Honduras take on the police. High school students have a unbelievable amount of energy, and they can fight police, throw rocks at police for a very long time. And so the police use a lot of tear gas against high school students. And so some young folks in the high school, after the protests had died down, walked around and collected tear gas canisters. And they came up to me, because I clearly am a foreigner, and they wanted to show me that the tear gas canisters were all US made, all US bought, and I looked them up, and they were all come from 3 different companies out of Pennsylvania. And so I think that it's really important to talk about why they're protesting, and I specifically mentioned healthcare and education, but also to give you a sense of why they're also fleeing. If Hondurans can't protest, if they can't change things in their own country, if they can't go onto the street without being tear gassed and shot at then they are obviously going to feel like they can't change their own reality, and they're going to leave, and they're going to come north. And so the status of education and healthcare in Honduras is largely what they're protesting. And it's because, I arrived to Honduras 10 years ago. The healthcare and education system has never been the greatest in Honduras, but it's much worse now 10 years later since I got there. And so what does this mean for Hondurans and their daily reality? So Hondurans and Honduran families that use the public education system that can't pay out of pocket for their education for their kids, they are increasingly having to pay user fees. And what are user fees? They have to purchase their own desks, their own uniforms, their own books. They have to pay for people to clean the school every day. They have to pay for a security guard to guard the school day and night. And that all comes out of parents' pockets. And it's becoming increasingly more and more difficult for Honduran families to pay that. Minimum wage is not increasing, and all prices around the country are increasing, and they just can't afford additional education costs. In the hospitals now, and this is one of the reasons that doctors are on the street, when you need to, for example, when you need to be stitched up, you need to bring your own thread, you need to bring your own needle, or the doctor can't serve you. There's no medications in the hospitals, there's no supplies. But if you ask the State Department, they'll say there's a public healthcare system that serves Hondurans. But that's not true when you actually need medications and you need any sort of supplies, bandages, Band-Aids, anything. You have to bring them to the hospital yourself, or doctors will not provide healthcare for you. And not to mention the fact that millions of dollars, there's been several major corruption scandals in Honduras over the last several years, and the one that shocks people the most is that the party in power, the national party in the country, has been linked to stealing $350 million from Social Security, from the Social Security system in the country. And so what's happening is that since the coup, there's been a slow process to privatize education, a slow process to privatize healthcare, and a slow process of privatizing a lot of things that basically allowed Hondurans to, or provided support to Hondurans. So for example, there's been slow privatization in energy. There's been slow privatization in healthcare and education, like I talked about. And what is happening with this privatization? When you have a national sort of sector like healthcare, education, energy, telecommunications, these things, like the government funds them, the government heavily controls them, the prices that consumers are paying for them. And what U.S. taxpayers' dollars have done, and I will talk a little bit more about that, is that they've helped the privatization process. And that what that has done is created markets for U.S. companies, for Canadian companies in a variety of services. So for example, in energy, there's a lot more U.S. companies in Honduras now that are generating energy and that are selling it to the government, and that's why Hondurans are paying much higher energy prices. And if you go to the border and you ask Hondurans, why are you fleeing? Higher energy prices is one of the things they will say. We can't pay the energy prices anymore in our homes. And so I've lived in Honduras, like I mentioned, for 10 years. In the last 2 years, my energy bill in my house has doubled. And I'm not a Honduran that is trying to survive off of minimum wage, which is roughly $250 a month. And that's the same with healthcare, and that's the same with education. And so, for example, there's been a whole series of laws, like I mentioned, that have slowly privatized a lot of these sectors. For example, in the energy sector, the many U.S. firms that are based in New York, such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, they've made a lot of money off of consulting for the Honduran government in creating these laws and creating the framework to help privatize these industries. Energy companies, like I mentioned, and also prison companies. My husband is a political prisoner, and he's being held in a U.S.-style prison that U.S. prison companies, the prison industrial complex from the U.S., have profited from. And so privatization has been opening markets for U.S. companies, but it means that it's changing the reality that Hondurans live every single day. It's increasing the cost of living, it's depleting services, and Hondurans can't pay those higher costs, they can't live in those kinds of conditions. And so they are forced to flee. Now, that's sort of like it's more of an economic issue about what's going on. The reality, the daily reality of life in Honduras has gotten more expensive. And so that's, Honduran migrants at the border will tell you that they just can't pay the increasing costs of living. But let's talk about the government and the U.S. support for the Honduran government. So I've done some congressional meetings. I've gone to Congress and I've talked to a variety of different Congress representatives, and many of them will tell you, well, Juan Orlando Hernandez and the Honduran government are a U.S. ally. They're important for us in the region. They're our ally. And I really hope that if there's anything that you learn tonight from this talk is that the United States government is allied with a narco-mafia government. That is what the Juan Orlando Hernandez government is. And why do I say that? What does it mean when you say it's a narco-mafia government? Well, a narco government is one that's involved in drug trafficking. There are members of the government from the highest levels all the way down to the municipal level that are involved in running drugs from Honduras into the United States. And it's a mafia because there's a small group of people, or it's actually expanding, a large group of people that occupy places in the government in key positions that have the same interests in drug trafficking or allowing their allies in the government to operate in total impunity. And it's all corrupt. Obviously, if you have a narco-mafia government, there's a lot of corruption going on in there. And so why do I say that Honduras is controlled by a mafia? Why do I say that it's involved in drug trafficking? And why do I say that there's major networks of corruption? And why are they a U.S. ally, if that's the case? So for example, in the last 10 years, there's been 2 presidents in the country. After they overthrew Mel Zelaya, there's been 2 presidents. One is Pepe Lobo, who was the president from 2010 to 2014. Let's talk about his family, okay? So his son, his name is Fabio Lobo, was extradited from Honduras, and he's currently in U.S. prison. He's been sentenced to 24 years for drug trafficking, for running drugs, for taking advantage of his role as the son of the president and working with drug cartels to allow them to run drugs with police and military that would set up, and it's very, very well outlined in the case in the Southern District Court in New York. So Fabio Lobo was the brother or the son of the president, and he would basically negotiate how they're going to run drugs across one of the northern highways in Honduras. And in the various testimonies that have come out in that court, he talks about basically working with the military and the police to set up blockades all along that northern road so that the drugs can pass freely through without any problem. So we're not just talking about the son of the president, we're now talking about the military, and we're now talking about the police that are also involved in drugs, in running drugs. The brother of the president, the brother of the president, his older brother, Ramon Lobo, the former president, he's on house arrest right now for stealing over $1 million US from social services or from state institutions, basically stealing public money for his own benefit. His wife, the wife of the former First Lady, her name is Rosa de Lobo. She's currently on trial in Honduras through an anti-corruption body, and she's facing 84 years for stealing money, literally taking money from the Ministry for Children and Family, from a program that was supposed to give shoes to poor families, and basically taking it and putting it in her personal account and stealing it. 84 years she is facing. Okay, so that's the former president.
Can I say, so who's doing the arresting, who's holding them?
Sure, so the United States is asking for the extradition of some of these figures, some of the drug traffickers and the money launderers, but with the wife of the former president, she is being persecuted by a special anti-corruption body that was recently set up in Honduras. It's run out of the Organization of American States, but they face significant challenges because the government's trying to get rid of it, because they're obviously taking down corruption networks that are affecting their own interests. I can go into that more in the question period if you remind me. So let's talk about the current president. So Tony Hernandez is the brother of Juan Orlando Hernandez. He was arrested in a U.S. airport, Houston Airport, in November of 2017. And he is known to be a leader, a major drug trafficker that since 2004 has been running drugs into the United States, running drugs and smuggling weapons. And in the reports that come out of that court from the New York prosecutor that is in charge of that case, they talk in the report that Tony Hernandez went and testified before the DEA in 2016 and that he totally lied to them about everything that was going on, saying that he was never involved in drug trafficking. And the prosecutor wrote this in his report. And he lied to us because he had become accustomed to total impunity. Now there's another drug trafficker that was also indicted along with the the president's brothers. His name is Miguel Calix Hernandez, and he's a very interesting drug trafficker. He doesn't get as much attention as the president's brother does, but his family members are all embedded inside the Honduran government. They work in very key positions inside the justice system and inside the prosecutor's office. So for example, Miguel Calix, his sister is a judge in a major department in Honduras who has been accused of letting Colombian drug traffickers free and not moving their case forward in courts. His cousin was the head of the fight against drug trafficking in the public prosecutor's office. So her job, his cousin's job inside the prosecutor's office was to investigate people like her cousin for drug trafficking, and the president's brother, and the former president's brother, and his son. And obviously, none of these investigations have been opened in Honduras related to drug trafficking. So I can go on and on and on about the networks of corruption and the mafia style of the government. That's like from the highest levels, but the United States actually just asked for the extradition of a mayor as well, because this goes all the way down to the lower level, to the lowest levels of government. And there was a mayor in a central department of Yoro, and he was recently just extradited. He ran an assassin ring, and he would kill people and bury them on his property, on a large farm on his property. And he also would kill indigenous people that were fighting to defend their forests against mining and illegal logging, because he was also involved in not only drug trafficking, but also in illegal logging. And he worked with people in the police and in the military. I forgot to mention that the president's brother, Tony Hernandez, also used military helicopters to run drugs. So we're talking a serious mafia narco government. And this is a U.S. ally in the region, but we don't hear about it. Nobody's talking about the fact that we're propping up a narco mafia government in the region. And they ask, why are people at the border? It's astonishing to me that there's all these drug cases going on and there's all this very clear evidence, but nobody's asking about why does the United States do business and why do they consider this government a U.S. ally? I think someone had a question. Do we want to wait to the end for questions or? Okay, all right. So I think one of the things that I really wanted to touch on, and when I was in Kansas City, someone sort of asked me at the question period that, you hear, when you go to the border and you talk to people that are seeking asylum, you'll hear a lot about them mention gangs and youth gangs as being one of the reasons that people flee. And I think it's really important to talk about youth gangs in the context of talking about a narco-mafia state. If the highest levels of the government are involved in organized crime and drug trafficking, what do you think the example is for the rest of the country? If they're not investigating the highest levels of the government for drug trafficking, for corruption, they're obviously not doing the same for the lower level organized crime. And it's not to mention how much those all link in. A lot of the times, these organized criminal structures use youth gangs to assassinate people on local levels. That's another thing that I try to explain very much to lawyers that are working on asylum cases. It's really difficult to separate criminal young youth gangs from these broader structures of organized crime on a larger level, and also the impunity and corruption in the government. If you're the president and the wife of the president, the first lady, and you're his family members, and you're working inside the government, and you're working to protect organized crime in those structures, and you're working to figure out how to launder your money and how to run tons of cocaine around the country, what do you think you're not doing? You're not governing the country. You're not taking care of social services. You're not going to care about healthcare. You're not going to care about the fact that there's no medications in the hospital. You're not going to care about the fact that like education is increasingly being depleted and their quality of education is not sufficient for your population. You're not going to care about your population because your purpose of getting in power isn't to take care of a population and to govern in a truly democratic way. Your purpose is to get in, to steal as much money as possible and abuse your power in order to steal money and run drugs. And this is a major US ally in the region. And we always need to remind ourselves that when we talk about asylum, when we talk about migration, that we are backing a narco-mafia government in Honduras. And so let's talk about the people that try and stay in Honduras. What happens to people that don't come to the US border? So in 2017, like I mentioned, there was elections in Honduras. And the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's in power now, he actually won. He won in another fraudulent election in 2013. And the Honduran constitution specifically bans re-election. They specifically ban it. So Juan Orlando Hernandez, in his first 4 years in power, what he did is he put judges in the Supreme Court that declared the part of the Constitution that didn't allow re-election. They declared the Constitution unconstitutional, and that allowed him to run for a second term. So he ran for a second term. In 2017, in November of 2017, was the elections. And when Juan Orlando Hernandez realized that the night of the elections that they were losing, all of a sudden the computer system crashed, and bam, it turned back on, and he was winning, Juan Orlando Hernandez. And so Hondurans, and it wasn't just Hondurans that were calling, saying it was a fraud. It was also the Organization of American States. They called for new elections, saying that there were just no way, there were so many irregularities, there's no way that they could guarantee that the results were free and fair. They called for elections to happen again. And so Hondurans, wanting to defend their vote, because they'd gone to and cast their ballot to say, we are not in agreement what's going on in this country. We don't like the neoliberal policies. We don't like what's happening with education and healthcare. So they went and they cast their ballot to try and vote the president in that they wanted, that was leading before the computer system crashed. And they were violently repressed. They were violently repressed in the streets. There were over 30 people shot. I've been in the country for 10 years, and it was the first time that the Honduran government used live rounds consistently on protesters. They still use live rounds regularly since 2017 against protesters. There were over 100 people that were injured, beaten, hundreds were detained, and some people, there's still 4 people, political prisoners, that remain in prison since the November 2017 elections, and my husband is one of them. And so Edwin, I'll talk a little bit about political prisoners. Edwin lived in the United States for many years, and he returned to Honduras right before the 2009 coup. And he spent the last 10 years fighting to change Honduras. And many Hondurans have been fighting since the coup to refound Honduras, to stop privatization, to actually demand security, and to demand better conditions in their country. And so Edwin, through the crisis during the 2017 elections, he was arrested, and within a day he was sent to a US-style maximum security prison about an hour and 15 minutes outside of the capital city where I live. And he's been there for a year and a half, and there's no trial date set. And so I go and visit him. There's no communication inside the prison, and these are prisons that were just built in 2016. And so the only way I can communicate with them is I have to go to the prison. There's no phones, there's no letters allowed, there's no books, there's no pens, there's no paper. There's only one television in the cell block where he is for 160 to 200 prisoners. And these prisons were built to house the most dangerous criminals in the country. And so he's with many members of organized criminal groups. And so Edwin, and I can talk more about his case and political prisoners' cases later, but Edwin is an example of somebody that stays in Honduras, that wanted to stay in Honduras despite being persecuted for many years for it. And him being in detention is what happens, or being in prison is what happens to people that try and stay and change the country. The indigenous leader, an environmentalist that's on my shirt, which you can't see, I'll move out to show you. She's another example of somebody that tried to stay in Honduras, that never wanted to leave Honduras, that stayed in Honduras to try and fight to change Honduras as well. And she was murdered in her home in 2016 by people linked to a private dam company and the Honduran military.
What is her name?
Berta Cáceres, thank you. Her name is Berta Cáceres. And she was a long-time activist, long-time, very well respected. She won the the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2015, a year before she was murdered. And then the Goldman Environmental Prize is very well known. It's considered the Nobel Peace Prize, but for environmentalists. And a year later, she was murdered in her home. And so Edwin and Berta are examples of what happened to Hondurans that want to stay, and they want to fight to change their country. They want to protest, like people do here, to try and change. And that's just example of two people. The over 30 people that went to the streets, that were murdered in the streets after the 2017 electoral crisis, they're also examples of people that try to stay and change the country. And you know, the 325 LGBTI activists that have been killed in the last 10 years in Honduras as well, the lawyers, the land defenders, the journalists. I mean, the list is endless. And they're threatened, they're persecuted, they're criminalized, they're thrown in jail, or they're killed. And so when we talk about migration, I think it's really important to talk about why people are coming, the root causes. The privatization that's underway, the way that the United States government's making it impossible for Hondurans to stay in Honduras, and propping up a government that doesn't care about its people, that Republicans called a failed state, which I don't really like the term, but most people understand what I mean by that. And I just want to give one more example, because I think it's really important to talk about what happens when the United States government tries to address these migration crises by throwing more money at it. So for example, in 2014, I'm not sure if people remember, but there was lots of media around the unaccompanied minors that were coming to the border. Okay, so the United States Congress decided to first they decided they were going to throw $1 billion at that problem in the Northern Triangle. It ended up being $750 million. And it was also called, not just the Alliance for Prosperity, but it was also called the Biden Plan. And even though I mentioned Biden, I must say, both parties have been awful on Honduras for a long time. This is not specifically directed at the Democrats. But they approved $750 million for the Northern Triangle. And that money went into furthering the privatization processes underway. And if you look online, there's like about 4 different pillars of where that money went. And one of them is to improve the penitentiary system. And my partner is in a jail that is new, that was built after that money was approved. There was a law that was passed to one of the many laws to privatize healthcare, but it's like the main law that really pushes privatization in healthcare and that helped purchase the services of the firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers to create the frameworks for privatization. Also was around that time when that money was passed in the $750 million for the Alliance for Prosperity. And all that money was to stop migration to the border and stop young people from coming to the border. And now, how many years later? 5 years later, we're right back at the same problem. And more people are coming to the border. Because since the 2017 electoral fraud, Hondurans started organizing caravans. And they started coming in mass numbers. And in many ways, Hondurans are voting with their feet. They can't stay in their country to change the United States government and the U.S. support for the government and the Canadian support, because Canada is just as bad, are supporting a government that's making it unlivable in the country. And so I think I'm going to leave it there. I threw out a lot at you, but I think that I just really want people to understand that there are root causes to migration, and U.S. policy needs to change in Central America, and specifically in Honduras, because that's the country I know best and I'm talking about. But migration is going to continue happening until the United States government dramatically changes its policies in Central America. And I want to say that especially today, because today in Congress, the House approved another $577 million for the Northern Triangle for the migration issue. And you read the bill, and it's the same thing as it was in 2014 for the Alliance for Prosperity. I don't think it'll pass through the Senate, as what I've been told by people that understand the bill better. But I think it's another indication that the United States government is once again doing the wrong thing and once again approaching a problem the wrong way. So yeah, I think I'm going to end there. I'm going to open for questions, and also I also want to talk a little bit about what people can do. I don't want people to feel the heaviness of the talk and walk out of here depressed, because that can be very paralyzing, and it means that we can't do anything about it, and there's lots that people can do. And so I don't know if we want to take questions first, and then I can talk about local ways that what people are promoting and local organizations, and also what's being done.
Why don't we have some questions and then we can, okay, Lynn?
Well, $750 million, how would you see it spent?
You repeat, the question is how would Karen see the $750 million spent?
So that's a hard question. This is why I'm not a politician and not in power.
I don't think it's possible.
But I would say that, these are really, really deeply rooted problems that have no easy solution. And I think that has to be recognized and acknowledged. I think that impunity and corruption in Honduras have to be addressed. And a lot of people say, well, how do you do that? And I would say that I think that there has to be very committed people that are leading the court system. So like the president of the Supreme Court, the attorney general have to be very, very committed to actually addressing the high levels of impunity and corruption in the country. And I think that they need international support to do that. But often that is not done the right way either, and it becomes a very politicized issue as well. So I would probably start there. I think corruption and impunity are very much at the root of a lot of these issues, and so some sort of way of dealing with those two things in a slow way, dismantling the organized criminal networks that have taken over the state are really important. I would probably start there.
I think you had a question then.
Yeah, if the United States says that Honduras is an ally for what? I mean, usually you have something you're both caring about at the same time.
That's actually a good question. I asked that I asked that once in DC, and I don't know. I would say it's an ally because it is a very strategic military point of interest. Like, it's geopolitically very important for the U.S. They currently have their largest military base in Honduras. It is Pomarola. It's the largest one in the region. And I think at any time they have between 500 and 600 U.S. soldiers on that base. And I would also say that because of the privatization processes underway in Honduras, like in the prisons, the energy, education, healthcare, they are markets that the U.S. has economic interests in. But honestly, with all of the issues going on at the border, I don't understand why people are not asking that. How is Juan Orlando Hernandez and his government an ally if they're sending all of these people to the border?
Right in the back.
You mentioned 500 million that was passed recently in the House was the wrong way, the wrong thing. Can you name the companies that are benefiting from these millions of dollars that we're sending down there? You mentioned Price Waterhouse. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, who are the other companies, like the prison industry, for example, Civic, which is making millions on putting immigrants away here in on our border?
Yeah, so a lot of the money that's approved, especially through the Alliance for Prosperity, like in 2014, there was money that was given by the international financial institutions, and those are like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and they are loaned to the Honduran government, and with that money, they basically hire New York-based firms, like I mentioned. Energy companies are a little bit harder. There's one called Logix that had a wind project that won a wind contract from the Honduran Congress for energy, to generate energy. And in the prison system, that information's not public, but what I've been able to gather is that the phone system is run by an American company called NCIC that also runs the phone systems in many of the prisons around the United States. And then when a lot of the development money goes to Honduras, it actually doesn't go to Honduran companies. It goes to funding, it's money that's given to large U.S. development companies here in the States. And so the money is always managed and run by those big development companies.
Is that true with the mining industry that you mentioned?
So the mining industry is, there is some American companies that are not coming to my mind, the names of them right now, that operate in the South, and they're operating open pit mining, like gold mines. Canada is really big on mining, so I'm more familiar with Canadian companies that have benefited. But I should say, while we're on the topic of mining, that in the last, the coup, there was a moratorium on mining concessions, and no new mining companies could start operations. And because of this sort of opening of Honduran markets, the Honduran government approved a very, very pro-industry mining law in 2014, and it sort of opened the floodgates for all these mining companies to go in. And once again, opened natural resources to private companies, creating markets for foreign companies.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, could I just maybe add another possible example, which is agribusiness, and I mean, Dole and United Fruit and all the successes of that.
Right.
I mean, that the whole entire global economic system is set up so those companies can remain in business, and so the countries are basically set up for export and not to benefit the people. And I don't think we can hear that, but.
Yeah, so that's actually really important. Thank you for mentioning that. I forgot, like, some of the most important, and at least important in terms of looking at the imperial history of the United States in Honduras, are the agro-industrial businesses, the Dole, Chiquita, banana. That a lot of your bananas that you buy in the grocery store are coming from Honduras or Guatemala, and African palm companies as well. And then one of them just came to my mind as you were talking, and I can't remember now, but if I think about it, I'll throw it in there.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
I think many in the room here, if we said, why are people leaving, going to the border, we would have thought gang violence. That's what we hear. I don't think you might have touched on that, but it wasn't big on your agenda for saying why people were leaving. You cited economic reasons and no future in the country. They had no optimism. So could you address that about the gangs, and also what is the government's posture on that? When they think of the gang violence or the violence in the country, what is their response to that?
Yeah, that's an important question. And a lot of people ask me about gangs. Like, there is a gang problem in Honduras. I'm definitely not going to deny that gangs are a serious issue. And actually, Juan Orlando Hernandez was tweeting today about the importance of maximum security prisons to deal with the MS-13 and the 18th Street gang. And they're the ones that are often mostly cited by people that are asking for asylum when they receive, extortions or threats from gangs or recruitment. Young kids they often try and recruit young kids, and that's something that a lot of the times you'll hear in asylum cases. And so I would say, like I already mentioned, gangs are definitely an issue in Honduras, youth gangs. But I would say gangs are not autonomous actors. They don't act alone. They're acting within a system. I sort of created a system of looking at how the highest levels of the government are involved in organized crime and drug trafficking, and that sort of funnels all the way down to the lower levels, up, down until the urban neighborhoods. So for example, I lived in an urban neighborhood in Tegucigalpa with my partner for 2.5 years, and in that area, the gangs operated, and they extorted businesses. And when I first got there, I couldn't really understand it. My mother-in-law would say, "Okay, you can't go out right now because the tax collector's out," and she was talking about the gangs that were extorting people. And so I often thought, well, like, why don't the police do something? I don't get it. Why don't people just go tell the police what's going on? And I soon found out, and watching over a couple of years, why people don't go to the police. It's because the police are often involved with the gangs. And the best example I have is the head police officer in the police post where I lived in that urban neighborhood. He was busted and arrested and sent to jail for running an extortion ring along with the gangs in that neighborhood. And so the police are very much infiltrated by the gangs and by organized crime, as are the military. And as I mentioned before, when we're looking at the family members of the president and the former president, they also use the military and the police to run drugs. And I just did an asylum case, worked on an asylum case, and a local authority, a government authority, was in a land conflict with a family that was, or a family was part of a land struggle, and their father was murdered. And the mayor used the gangs to kill, he paid the gangs, like a local gang, an assassin who's part of an organized criminal structure, to kill their father. And so when you're talking about, when you go from the top all the way to the bottom, you're seeing that the state institutions that are supposed to be stopping the crime and responding to people and making people feel safe, they're all infiltrated by organized crime. And so citizens can't do anything to actually have the problem addressed and why is it you can't go to the police station to say that this guy's asking me for 500 lempiras or like $25 every week to run my taxi? Well, because they know that the local police officers are also involved in that, or they get a cut from that. And so it's this vicious cycle. You're not going to go to the authorities, and the crime is going to continue happening. And how do you stop that? You need to address why people are not being held accountable for the crime. From the top all the way to the bottom. They need to address impunity. People need to be able to feel like they can go to state authorities and announce something, and that state authorities will take their concerns seriously, and they will do something to stop it from happening. And when that doesn't happen, there's a complete breakdown of the ability of the state to address crime and gangs and the perpetuation of organized crime and gangs. I don't know if that makes sense. These are very complex issues, and they're different in every area of Honduras. But I find that it's really hard for people in North America to understand what happens when a state is a mafia state and when it's a narco-mafia state. It's very hard to understand how to maneuver those issues, to the point where sometimes I go to the urban neighborhood where my partner lives, and his family won't say anything rude to the taxi drivers that block their driveway. And I was like, well, why not? Well, because, we don't really know, they're defenseless. There's no one that'll come to your support if something happens. And it's really hard for people up here to understand that, I think.
Second row.
Are you an attorney? And how do you manage to stay out of jail?
No, I'm not an attorney. I've been doing human rights defense work for 10 years, so I have a certain level of knowledge of the Honduran legal system, but But for me, I think that like one of the things that a lot of foreigners do on delegations, on missions, Witness for Peace also has a great program. They do accompaniment, and one of the things that I do is I basically use my whiteness, my privilege, the racism in the system, to accompany Hondurans and accompany communities and groups to sort of let the government know that there are outside eyes watching. And it's not just me, because I can come here and talk to you, and you all know you listen to what I say, and then therefore might respond and call your Congress people, and it initiates a reaction. And so I think that that's sort of the strategy that we use. Because I live and work in Honduras, it's a little bit different when you're just visiting temporarily than like living long term. So there's lots of measures you have to take. Once again, it's really hard for people to understand that here. I think most people, you have to take a lot of precautions. Since my husband went to jail in 2007 or in 2018, beginning of 2018, the government has tried many times to kick me out of the country. But it's nothing to what they try and do to Hondurans. It's nothing to what Honduran human rights defenders face, and journalists and lawyers and LGBT folks and environmentalists and land defenders. So we try and do accompaniment and to get the word out and rely on solidarity, rely on people responding to urgent actions, rely on people to go on delegations to sort of help the Honduran authorities, or make the Honduran authorities know that if they do something against somebody, that it won't go unseen and unheard outside the country.
Would you speak something about the United States and Canadian embassies? We expect them to be the eyes and ears on the ground. Do they know what you know, or what's the role of the embassies?
This is being live streamed. So I do believe that there are some good folks that work in these very difficult structures of power. And there are some good folks, and that are not necessarily in agreement about what the policies of the U.S., what the U.S. and Canadian embassies are promoting in the country. They absolutely know. They absolutely know what kind of government they're supporting. I mean, the prosecutor in New York definitely knows, which means the Department of Justice definitely knows. And they can date back all the drug trafficking until 2004. So I'm not really sure how it's been, how many years? 15 years since they've decided to arrest these folks. And these are just people in a system that is a narco-mafia system. So I usually say, because I'm Canadian, I can go harder on my government. I usually say that the Canadian embassies are nothing more than promotional offices for mining companies. And I'm very clear about that. They rarely come to my defense or my support as a Canadian citizen, and they haven't very much at all with this case of my partner. He's Honduran, but they have done very little. And the Canadians talk way more about human rights than you guys do in terms of being important for them. And they do the same as the United States Embassy. The U.S. Embassy is much larger. It's the largest embassy in Tegucigalpa, or in Honduras. And they take orders from Washington. And this is why it's very important for people to hold the State Department and the embassy in Tegucigalpa. This is why congressional work is really important. This is why calling your congressman when there's an urgent action is really important, because they can call State Department, and then the embassy and you assume that the embassy in Honduras will hear about that this congressperson is concerned about a killing or a threat or whatever. I mean, we can talk later about that. I can actually tell you more about what I think, but for purposes of live streaming, I'll stop there.
In the back there.
I have both a comment and a question. The statement was made, why does the U.S. support the Honduran government? I think we have to also look back that we've always been, as a country, seem to want to support anti-communist and other types of ideologies in the region. So we supported the Contras who are in Honduras, but also fighting the Sandinistas. And so we've been afraid of certain things that relate to Cuba, relate to other movements that we've seen as popular movements we've equated with communism. So that's just my read on some things. But here's my question. So we have a lot of people coming at the border. There are the UN High Commission for Refugees. Somebody seeking asylum is the same categorization as somebody who's been granted refugee status in the United States. So there's only 5 things that somebody can claim for a refugee or asylum status. But at the border, those things have seemed to change somewhat. Fleeing gang violence or a threat of being killed from gangs has been dropped off the list. Can you tell us something about who's getting asylum and what are the types of claims that people are being upheld by the U.S. Department of Justice and the asylum judges who are looking at not just Hondurans, but especially Hondurans coming at the border?
So I think it's a really good and important question. Unfortunately, I can't answer it. I don't do work on the border. I more focus on sort of the root causes as to why people are leaving Honduras and less on why, like what happens at the border, the conditions, what people why people are asking for political asylum. So I'm really sorry I can't, but I know there are people in the audience that can. So does somebody want to answer that question?
I can just make a comment. So the Advocates for Human Rights does a lot of work representing asylum seekers and has sent attorneys to the border. They have a webpage and they are regularly doing outreach and education. So it's very easy to find a forum where you can learn more about what types of cases are being approved. And I can also say that victims of gang violence are still winning their immigration cases, although it's a lot more challenging than it's been in the past. So the 5 categories for being granted asylum: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group.
Well, in contrast to the current regime, would you talk a little bit more about the government of Manuel Zelaya back 10 years ago, and some of the positive measures that were being taken then before the coup? What you mentioned, the putting a hold on mining concessions, one thing, but there's other things that were going on as well.
Yeah, so the 2009 coup in Honduras basically is a time in Honduran history that you can't really talk about the current situation without referring to it and the importance of the coup in Honduras and on the daily reality of people's lives that have slowly gotten worse since then. So the coup, like Joe mentioned, is they overthrew the Honduran military overthrew the elected president Manuel Zelaya. A lot of people say he's a left-leaning president. I would say he's slightly left, central government. But what he was trying to do is he was basically trying to make tiny reforms that considered the majority of the population in Honduras that has been ignored for decades. So, for example, what was he trying to do? A lot of when you Google Mel Zelaya and you talk about why the U.S. might have had a problem with him, a lot of people talk about him joining the ELBA countries, about getting closer with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But for Hondurans, I think on a daily sort of their daily experiences in Honduras, what the presidency of Manuel Zelaya meant, or his policies, was that he changed the national formula to calculate gas prices in the country. So people were paying less for gas, but U.S. companies were making less profit. He raised the minimum wage. He renegotiated collective contracts for teachers. He had an energy subsidy program that basically provided subsidies for the poorest families in Honduras. He actually went and had this program, which I find really incredible, is that he went and he had this program where his government handed out energy efficient light bulbs to all these households. And sometimes I'll walk into a house, I sometimes have to change houses, and I've rented houses, and people are like, oh, that's a light bulb from when Mel Zelaya had that program. They gave us more energy efficient light bulbs to cut down our energy costs. And so he did a whole bunch of different things. He started pushing through land disputes that basically were small farmers that needed the land to grow food for subsistence farming. He started pushing through some of the land claims that they had against large landowners for African palm or for banana companies. He did a whole bunch of different things. But I think one thing it's important to remember is that he was somebody that was from the traditional oligarchy families, and he slowly started changing the time that he was in power. And definitely, one of the things actually, and I forgot to, this is one of the most important things too, is that he wanted to call a National Constituent Assembly to rewrite the Constitution as well. And that was along with the false accusations that he wanted to change the Constitution to stay in power. And that's interesting because Juan Orlando Hernandez just did that, and he wasn't overthrown in a military coup. And it's important to mention that the United States government backed that coup, as did the Canadian government. And Honduras has spiraled into a very difficult situation that has caused increasing migration to the U.S. border since then.
In the midst of what you're saying, how do Hondurans have hope? What gives them hope?
So yeah, I think this topic sounds really heavy when you're sitting in the United States. I think that people, when I talk to people in the U.S. and Canada, people are like, oh, this is so depressing. The world is so depressing. Honduras sounds so depressing. And I've been there for 10 years, and when I'm in Honduras, I feel much more inspired than I do when I am here in the north. And one of the reasons for that is that I think the resilience of people in Honduras is pretty amazing, and it's hard to explain it. I encourage people to join a delegation at some point. The Solidarity Collective, the Witness for Peace, does delegations all the time to Honduras. They're a local group. Go on a delegation, and you'll see the really amazing stuff that Hondurans do. Like, for example, Honduran women are probably the most badass resistors. Women are usually always the ones that are at the front line of a lot of these fights and struggles. And on the Honduran Solidarity Network, we have published some videos of showing women that are going to the roads to block off the roads in this whole fight to not privatize healthcare and education, and they're doing Zumba in the middle of the roadblock, and it becomes sort of this daily thing that they do. And I think that there's a lot of Hondurans that are, the resistance is incredibly inspiring. It's hard to get a sense of that, but that's what's kept me there for 10 years. That's what drew me in. I went to Honduras 10 years ago. I was going to stay for 2 months, and it's 10 years later, and now my partner's in jail, and now I can't leave. But it's just really incredible, the creative ways that they resist. Communities will say, well, okay, well, you can go and pass that. You can go ahead and pass that concession for our river. We'll be waiting for you in our community when you decide to show up. And they have such creative ways that they go about resisting and protecting what is theirs. And there's this understanding, it's a really different dynamic, but it's very, very inspiring. And I don't want people to think that, it's not easy. I don't want to romanticize it either, because it's not. It's hard. People are getting shot in the streets. People are fleeing. People are going through very difficult times. They are internally displaced, or they flee the border. And so there's nothing romantic about it, and there's nothing it's all easy and all great and all fun, and Zumba's the way to go. But it's really incredible, all the amazing ways that Hondurans resist, and they keep resisting.
You said the House of Representatives just passed a bill to give over $500 million for stability. That had to be a lot of Democrats. Can you name any Democrats that really get it and might even have second thoughts about the wisdom of that?
So I'm going to probably not answer that question because I don't know all the Democrats. If you want someone to answer that question, I'm going to put Elise on the spot. She's probably the person that knows better than I do. Somebody asked me about like presidential candidates too, who I felt if there's any presidential candidates that are like remotely getting the root causes and the U.S. role in the root causes, and I also defaulted on that one and sent it to somebody else. So I don't know if Elise wants to comment on it or somebody else that's more familiar with all the options that there are in the Democratic Party or not.
I just say in terms of the vote today, in terms of the vote today, I would just say that the folks that are on the Privatization Act are the folks who get it, which are 67 members of the House of Representatives. The vote today was determining around whether or not the Alliance for Prosperity or this new plan would go forward. So the options were limited in terms of what people were voting on.
And Elise mentioned the Berta Cáceres Act, and I haven't talked about it yet because we haven't gotten to the to-do stuff yet. And I just wanted to, now that she's mentioned it, it's important to talk about what it is. And Elise, once again, is probably better at talking about it than I am. But the Berta Cáceres Act, Berta Cáceres, like I mentioned, was an indigenous leader. But she wasn't just, she didn't just fight for indigenous rights. She was very much a social movement leader in Honduras and in Central America. Very, very important figure. There really is nobody that is like her in the country. Very charismatic leader, and she was murdered in her home on March 2nd of 2016. And so there was a bill that was put together in 2016, and it is about cutting security aid off to the Honduran government. And so Elise and lots of folks here in the Twin Cities have been working on and working with groups all across the country to get congressional signers or co-sponsors or that to sign on to support the bill. And it's basically cutting off security aid to the Honduran government, recognizing that military and aid to the military and police that are shooting people in the streets, that are killing indigenous leaders and social movement leaders like Berta, needs to stop until the Honduran government shows that it actually cares slightly about human rights. And there's a set of sort of human rights cases that are mentioned in the bill that the Honduran government has to show or bring justice for, a list of those cases. And so the Honduran Solidarity Network is, and a whole bunch of different organizations around the United States are asking people to contact their congresspeople and ask them to sign on to the bill or to tell them about it. And Sherilyn's holding up some stuff. I don't know if you want to talk about what those are.
Just say if you'd like to send a postcard to your congressperson. There are several postcards back here to the senators and some of the representatives in Minnesota. The text is already filled out for you, so take a look. You can just sign the back with your name and address, and we'll put a stamp on it and mail it for you.
And I mentioned some, so the Berta Cáceres Act is one way folks can get involved. I would highly encourage people to go on delegations. Delegations are a way that you can go, and I think it's one thing to sit here and hear about what's going on in Honduras, but it's another thing to go to the country and talk to Hondurans and visit communities and see the impacts of what's going on. Sometimes I take delegations and we go to talk to a Garifuna, an Afro-Indigenous community that's being evicted by foreign tourist interests, and then I take them to the hotel that is evicting the communities, and so people see what the stark contrast is, and you really get a sense of what is going on in the country. And I think that it's really an invaluable experience that really allows you, it gives you a lot of ways to talk to your congresspeople, to talk to your local media about what's going on, and to understand why people are heading to the border.
I would just add that, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Ilhan Omar and Betty McCollum are the two representatives that are on board right now. We met today with Angie Craig, and we're trying to lobby her. But if there are any constituents here of Dean Phillips, we're looking for a contingent. Okay, we want to have a meeting with him too. So.
One thing too that Ken mentioned at the beginning too is that ways that people can get involved as well is that tonight we're collecting for a bail fund for the 4 political prisoners, including my husband, that are in prison. And that money we expect, although because of all the judicial delays, we're expecting that a bail hearing will come up in the next couple of months, and we want to use that money to offer bail. The bail is so high, and I have a GoFundMe page that we're also collecting donations. The bail is so high because my husband and the other political prisoner that he's with, Raul Alvarez, they're being tried in the court system that was created to try members of organized crime and drug traffickers. And so the bail in those courts are much higher versus a normal Honduran court system. And so the Honduran government in their cases is arguing that because they participated in a protest, they're organized criminals. And so that's a very, very risky thing to say about protesters, and that's part of the criminalization of the people that stay in Honduras and protest.
How do we find out?
So the GoFundMe page, you can either donate tonight, or there's a GoFundMe page. It's gofundme.com/politicalprisonershn.
Back here.
What kind of representation does your husband have in Honduras? I mean, are there court-appointed lawyers, or does he have a private, or how does it work?
He has 2 private lawyers, and the other political prisoners, we sort of all get together and strategize together. So we have human rights organizations that are on the legal team, and we have 2 private lawyers. I have to cover the costs for a lawyer to go twice a week to make sure they're still alive in the prison, because there's no way of communicating with them. And so that's something that we have to do. But the problem is that, you know, the court system is totally corrupt, and when you're an opponent or you're someone speaking out against the government, the legal system is another tool of repression that is used and abused as the governing folks want to use it. And so, you know, for example, Berta Cáceres, what they did with her is they tried to criminalize her for fighting a private company that wanted to build a dam on a river without local community consent. They tried to throw her in jail first. When they couldn't throw her in jail because she went into hiding, they killed her. And so these cases of when the justice system is used, it's often used against, it's very strong. And this is another thing that I really want people to understand as well is that when people say that the state is very weak, the Honduran state is very weak, it's really not. It's very strong when it wants to be. It's so strong that it arrested the Justice Department, the prosecutor, they all worked together to arrest my partner, and within a day he was in a maximum security prison. And it's very strong when it wants to be, and it's very weak when it doesn't. When it wants to go after the brother for drug trafficking, doesn't work, there's no case open, there's no investigation. When it wants to go after someone like Berta Cáceres, or somebody, an indigenous community, or my partner, it is very, very strong, and they use it and abuse it as much as they possibly can, which serves the interests of the people that are in power, the government.
Based on my experience on delegation in Guatemala and hearing all very, very similar themes from what I learned from human rights advocates like you there. And one of the strongest themes that came out of my learnings there was that getting access to good and reliable information, journalists are so oppressed that it's hard for them to get that out. And GHRC is one great one that I rely on, and one great source. I'm wondering if there's one for information on Honduras that we can share widely.
In English, the Honduran Solidarity Network has a really great Facebook page where every single day we're posting about what's going on. And we also have a Twitter. That's for English speakers that don't speak Spanish. In Spanish, there is a fantastic independent radio station that's run by the Jesuits called Radio Progreso. And so when you Google it, it has to be Radio Progreso Honduras. They have really fantastic news. There's also a website that's called Defensores en Línea, which is run by a Tegucigalpa-based human rights organization called COFADE, the Committee of the Relatives of the Detained and Disappeared in Honduras. They also put out really great stuff as well.
About Radio Progreso, my daughter spoke here about 3 weeks ago of our trip to Honduras, and the head of Radio Progreso is Father Mello, a Jesuit priest. And he's kind of like a Romero type. Everybody listens to him and the government hates him. They're planning to bring him, this is a group in California, an interfaith group, planning to bring him to the U.S. in September. And also a guy named Juan Lopez, who will get a Moffett-Letelier Award for his work on human rights. So, pretty sure they will come in September, and they want them to testify in the U.S. Congress as well. Whether they come to Minnesota or not depends upon the local groups and whether we want them to stop by Minnesota when they come. So I'm with Amnesty International in the Twin Cities. We have a subgroup on Honduras. I'll have a sign-up sheet back there. If you want to sign it, I will send you any announcements we have, not only about that, but about Amnesty International actions on Honduras.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would really encourage people to, if you can get it together, to bring Padre Melo and Juan Lopez here. Juan Lopez was also in prison for a short period of time. He was criminalized for defending his land against a internationally financed mining company. And he's free, but he was criminalized as a result of that.
Rico?
Yes, thank you. Well, first, thank you so much for sharing. You know, you're really brave. And but I just wanted to mention something, you know, because always we hear in the news also, you know, how all the migrants come to the border, and we hear just very little for what is happening, the reality. I'm from the border. I'm Mexican. I'm from Juarez, and all these stories, you know, that what we hear from all these migrants. My home, you know, my family, they always host people from Honduras who come and trying to make it. Some of them, they stay in Juarez, you know. But what we hear always is the whole story, right? What is happening in Honduras for a while, but now is deeper, much deeper. What I would like to say, you know, is encouraging you to think that it's something deeper. And when the people show up at the border, they said only what is the type of language that they can say. Oh yes, I'm running away from gangs, because it's what they can be defended of. But I mean, it's people. The system is not livable. People cannot live. People cannot work. People cannot be without corruption or anything. Nothing to provide for the children or, you know, the kids. I mean, it's horrible there. But the stories that we hear from the community, from all those people from Honduras, is terrible. Again, they just go to the border and just say what they've been told to say, you know, in order to come here. But it's much more. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that comment's really important. I mean, imagine basically picking up your family and leaving your house and leaving every single thing inside your house and packing the little that you have into a backpack and starting to walk. Like, something really has to be wrong. Also, the attorneys this morning that I went to speak with asked me, you know, we have a lot of people that talk about gangs, you know, or gangs are threatening them. And, you know, is there questions that we can ask to sort of understand how those gangs fit into power structures? And these gangs are part of power structures. The gangs are protected by the police that are part of a state structure that are supposed to be investigating and arresting people that are committing crime and when they're not. So really, when someone comes to the border and they're saying, I'm being threatened by gangs, they're being threatened by an entire structure that is the state that is not protecting them. And I think that people don't understand that when they hear these oversimplified stories in the corporate media about why people are coming. They're really not talking about the root factors.
Are they afraid to say that?
I mean, people are fleeing really traumatic situations. Sometimes when they get a gang threat, they don't necessarily, I'm making a lot of assumptions by answering, but a lot of people are scared. I find, you know, I've lived in Honduras for 10 years, and when I go and take testimony in communities of people that don't know me, I was like, okay, so what happened? What's going on? What, you know, the violence, the threat against you? They'll be like, okay, well, it was this person, and this person did it to me, and they see me as a gringo that doesn't necessarily understand the complexities of what they're living. And so when you start asking more and more questions, you're like, okay, well, you're being threatened by that family's linked, that family's feared in the community because of what they're involved in, and they're like the promoters of the mayor. They worked on the mayor's campaign, and the mayor protects them and will never touch like their interests. And so it's like these power structures. And once again, for me, it goes back to the point where from here, from our, when I say you have to put your cap on, I have to take my cap off when I leave Honduras and put a cap on here, we really don't understand what it's like to live under a narco-mafia state. We have no concept of understanding what it means to be fleeing organized crime that is both living among you sometimes in some of the communities, but also that is managing the entire structure of the state.
You kind of maybe said this, but I'm hoping that maybe you'll emphasize a little bit more. I mean, the fact of the matter is that none of these illegal narco governments would be in power were not for the direct support of the United States of America. The United States wants them in power. And so, and I think that, you said it kind of politely, but I think we should all remember that fact.
Yeah, I think that's...
And the rest of the hemisphere did not respond, for instance, to the coup in the same way.
Yeah, so when people talk about, oh, look at the border, look at the conditions at the border, well, the United States is propping up a narco-mafia state, and that is our ally in the region.
Rick? Really appreciate how you're outlining this narco part of it, because I've been to like 4 or 5 programs on Honduras, and you're the sharpest on that point. I wanted to get back to how the U.S. and the embassies always support the oligarchs and the super rich in these countries because their corporate interests are in line.
Yeah.
Whether it's mining, whether it's oil, whether it's agribusiness.
I was actually just talking to Ken about this, and we were focusing on, when we were coming here, and we were focusing on, he was telling me that someone said to him once that Tegucigalpa, the capital city, has got the highest concentration of U.S. fast food restaurants. And so if you look at who owns those franchises, they're always the rich families. U.S. franchises, whether it's the Intercontinental Hotel, the Marriott Hotel, Burger King, Wendy's, McDonald's, Church's Chicken, Circle K, et cetera, they're all owned by the Honduran elite. The 10 to 12 families that have maintained power over Honduras through the 2 traditional political parties for decades. And that's just the fast food industry, right? And then we're talking the sectors that you mentioned, energy, mining, healthcare, education, companies that are profiting off that slow privatization process. And it's about markets, and it's about economic interests as well, and the oligarchs in those countries are the ones that are promoting U.S. companies and creating markets for them in Honduras. So they're essential allies. And if you look through WikiLeaks documents, you'll notice that you can go back and read through them, and I don't remember what chain it was, but in one of the WikiLeaks documents, the communication is about how a new oligarch family is opening up a new U.S. fast food chain, and how they're like celebrating that in the cable. And you forget about that kind of stuff, but it's absolutely essential for why the United States is propping up these families that are deeply involved in corruption and drug trafficking in the country. So I can go through again what people can do. I mean, I don't do people, so the Berta Cáceres Act, contact your congressional folks, your congressional representatives, and ask them to sign on to the Berta Cáceres Act. Elise, I keep putting you on the spot, but Elise is like the person to go to on the Berta Cáceres Act. She's done amazing work on it. And I'm sort of in Honduras, so I'm not as like up on, what representatives have signed and like who to target. And Elise is like the person about on that. She's done amazing work. And the Witness for Peace team. So also there's delegations. There's a lot of local groups in the room tonight that have lots of ways that you can get involved. These 2 knew me when I was a baby activist before I could speak Spanish. And they're like long-time activists as well that have lots of ideas. But I think organizing locally is really important as well. Donations to the local groups that are doing awesome solidarity work, whether it's Hands Off Honduras, Witness for Peace, or Solidarity Collective, that keeps their work going, and it's really important that they're supported. Also, there's the bail fund if people are interested as well. I just keep the topic of the root causes of migration in your conversations with your family, your friends, your local media is also really important. Letters to the editor. Those are the things that mostly come to mind about what to do. I don't know if there's other ideas.
I would just mention two things. Witness for Peace Midwest runs delegation to Honduras. I went on 2 of them, and I would really recommend doing that. And
December 3rd to 12th is the next one.
There you go.
You're planning
December 3rd to 12th.
December 3rd to 12th. Go to solidaritycollective.org and you can get more information or just talk to me afterwards.
there's also a flyer in the back that you all should have gotten that has information on Hands Off Honduras. We're a group that meets a couple times a month, and you know, we're responsible for this event tonight. But we're also a part of a coalition called Minnesota Caravan Solidarity. Is there information on one of the flyers there? No, there isn't. Okay. Well, if you're interested in, we have a coalition of groups that get together a couple times a month to strategize, doing protest events and organizing around the caravan and the migration issue. If anyone's interested in that, contact Hands Off Honduras, and we can put you in touch with our next meetings as well. Sherilyn, do you want to add anything else as far as things to do locally, or Marcial?
No, I just want don't take the picture from me, please. This is how intimidating it is. You mentioned something very interesting, that is how strong is the government of Honduras. The Honduran government is not a strong government. It's strong because the U.S. support. That's why it's strong. So it was not for that, it's not strong, because the people is very strong fighting in the street. But they have the support of the U.S., that's why it's strong. And this is how intimidated this thing, because they have, I have been participating in some chat, and you receive threats from the chat when you are chatting with people in Honduras. They infiltrate people from the government, from the call center, to counterattack people who are supporting like UNTV and people who are fighting them. They attack you right away. You see how it's mafia, how they are organized to attack people and maintain that what happened in 2009 when Pepe Lobo say Honduras is open for business. Of course, they want to support something like that because the opportunity to impound the government, impound the country. Either way, it has been impounded since the 1800s, but now is a great opportunity that even European countries that used to be very well defended of human rights are silent because they are in the business there too. European companies from Denmark, from Norway, Germany, they used to be, in the 90s, they used to be the delegation of European countries, and because I was working with United Nations there, and I saw, and I worked with some European countries, defenders of the human rights. They were defending human rights when the situation in El Salvador and the refugee in Honduras. But now, they are business people from Europe, together with the United States, trying to get advantage of the Honduras open for business for benefit, profit. That's what you see with those all dams construction and business development in Honduras. And that is why no Honduran people want to talk when it's a live stream, because if you have family there, you don't know what they can do then, If you are a Honduras here and you are not a citizen, you can have repression here too. And then, yes, I want to say that. But I will encourage people here to sign the list as a Hand of Honduras member. Sign the list and participate and support this group and this campaign. We are part of the Honduran Solidarity Network too, and then we would like to have your address, your contact, telephone and email, that we can send you to future presentation that we can have from Honduras. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. So making questions? Are you Ryan?
No, I can stick around.
You want to keep asking questions?
So I'll stick around. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Once again, thank you to Hands Off Honduras for organizing